The Loudmouth Minorities. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. Many of you will have been scratching your head recently wondering how it is that certain loudmouth minorities are calling the shots, that they're ruling the roost. There's controversy, of course, as a consequence of a man who identifies essentially as being a teenage girl becoming the face of Bud Light. There's the fact that that same individual is seen prancing around in leggings and a sports bra, claiming to identify as being female. And yet this individual, with a vocal minority, calls the shots. Roald Dahl's work had to be edited because some numbskull somewhere decided that certain ideas that were put forward, the author's own work, shouldn't be allowed, that they had the ridiculous notion that they were entitled to edit the original works to apparently make them more palpable for a modern-day audience. The reaction, of course, showed that they gauged that incorrectly. The Scottish National Party may not be on the political radar of many of you, but that party has been captured by a small group of fanatics. And basically, there is a long-known phenomenon in history of loudmouth minorities taking over. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Kate Forbes, who was the former finance minister of Scotland, might be reflecting that the Almighty can be gratifyingly swift in settling debts. Forbes was narrowly defeated by a rival who attacked her profession of the Christian faith, while weaseling out of declaring his own religious commitments. What does that sound like to you? Yet within days of his election, there were police in Nicola Sturgeon's garden, and the SNP's auditors, Scottish National Party, had made their excuses and left. Not even the sternest elders would censure Forbes for muttering God is good under her breath. There's a good chance that soon the shrinking membership will grasp that it elected the wrong leader and roll away the stone that entombed her political career. She could usefully spend the time before resurrection considering how the Scottish National Party's collapse was triggered in part by the actions of a tiny band of fanatics, committed to the belief that anyone can decide that they are a woman just because they feel like it. After all, remember, feelings are not facts, and we're seeing increasingly these tiny bands of fanatics taking over. The Scottish National Party is well placed to understand how a tail with a minority obsession can end up wagging the dog, since that's actually the story of its own ascent. That party failed to win more than a single parliamentary seat in its first 40 years of existence. But then it almost extinguished itself by internal warfare, where the Judean People's Front, not the People's Front of Judea, splitters, and they were treated as a joke by Scotland's political establishment. Yet now, the Scottish National Party dominates Holyrood, and Labour's hopes of victory at the next general election rest on the demise of the Scottish National Party. But the SNP isn't alone in confronting the threat of an extremist tail wagging the mainstream dog. It's an institutional capture, the takeover of large groups of people by small teams of determined, single-minded individuals imbued with the sincere belief that they are called to save humanity in spite of itself. Who might be sufficiently deluded to believe that their rights are greater than that of other people? Who is it who might believe that they as an individual are more important than the majority? Who is it that comes riding in thinking that they are here to save humanity? It's important to remember this isn't a matter of left or right. For instance, in the United Kingdom, the Tory brand was wrecked by the manoeuvrings of fringe groupings for whom no version of Brexit could ever be pure enough. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, still finds it impossible to adopt the language of his own voters on matters of sex for fear of offending his younger supporters. Even non-partisan movements with good causes to fight are undermined by the tail waggers. Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion have forced mainstream politicians to adopt unpopular low-traffic neighbourhoods in London. The police find themselves cooperating with Islamist sects on the grounds that not to do so might see them branded as Islamophobic. The bright promise of the Black Lives Matter movement evaporated the day that its leaders adopted the slogan "Defund the Police" and swerved into an ideological digression about reparations for slavery. The sway of extremists in modern movements isn't new at all. It's now almost exactly a century since the most effective tail-wagger of modern times, Vladimir Lenin, was muted by a stroke. But in the chaos of revolutionary Russia, he'd already set a template for the triumph of the few over the many, which of course is very much the way of the narcissist, isn't it? The Bolsheviks worked harder than anyone else. Lenin wore his enemies down, arguing through the night. Application of attrition. His refusal to compromise, assertion of control, intimidated lesser spirits. The Bolsheviks weren't the first to insist that their disciples had to give up everything and be professional revolutionaries. As someone once said, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." Second, the tail-waggers claim to speak for entire groups of classes of people, usually without much justification, delusion, sense of entitlement. In 1917, the Bolsheviks said they were the voice of the entire proletariat, much as Robespierre had spoken for the sans-culottes. Today, Stonewall claims to have the entire LGBT community in its ranks. The various BLM groups say they speak for all black folk. Notice here the objectification that takes place as these small groups think that they are representative of everybody. But they get away with it because often those they are combating lack diversity in their own ranks, and they lack the confidence to challenge these extremists. Thirdly, they have no qualms about ruthlessly exploiting any traces of personal guilt. Use of guilt as a manipulation, absence of remorse, absence of conscience. An elite class that is largely white and male worries about its own culpability and injustice. Reports of sexual harassment by other business leaders will leave many wondering if they too have ever stepped over the line. White privilege touches the tender parts of the conscience. Liberal guilt is fair game in any circumstance, but it leads to weak leadership, frightened of its own shadow. Finally, they deploy the half-truth without conscience. Who does that? Yes, our kind. We learned recently that the brass manillas from which the Benin bronzes were sculpted probably actually came from Europe. Bristol was probably at one point the largest manufacturer of such objects. There's very little said about what the Nigerians gave the Europeans in return for the metal, which was common currency in Africa. Some people might ask the oil-rich state how much it plans to offer the descendants of slaves sold into what Bob Marley called the bottomless pit of the Atlantic trade. What value do they place upon the black people that were sold into slavery there by those in the Arab world? Week by week, loud and unrepresentative groups still get their way, cornering people who should know better into agreeing to things that they know to be wrong, basically blackmailing them, bullying them, intimidating them. The traditional moderating influences such as trade unions and churches are in decline, and what little is left of their power has itself been captured by these small groups. And the cleverest part of the extremist surge has been to allow the political and media elite to convince itself that this culture war stuff is all just being made up by the right to prevent progress. It took 70 years to unwind the capture of the Russian state by a tiny group of Bolsheviks. The world is still paying the price for that. It remains the case now that so many of these small groups that leave you scratching your head as to how they got into their position are actually groups of narcissists, or one narcissist leading those members of the coterie. Vociferous in what they have to say, operating without conscience, operating without remorse, manipulative, desperate to lay their hands upon power by whatever means necessary, as a consequence, of course, of operating through the various manipulations that the narcissist has. They infiltrate groups and cause larger institutions to come to their knees. The institutional takeover, the institutional capture, is being undertaken by narcissists. And I repeatedly tell you all this, and yet So many of you are far more interested in wondering what Harry's wife is going to be doing next week than actually realising that your lives are being adversely affected by certain narcissists getting themselves into positions of power. That the mainstream media fails to recognise that this is what is going on. And I tell you time and time again, that there will come a point where I will turn around to you and say, I did warn you. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.